Hey YouTube, back at it. I wanted to show you what I've been working on here. The 3900 is mounted, and right now I am working on the wiring harness for it. What I did here is I pretty much eliminated almost the entire factory wiring harness, which I'll show you. Here is the factory harness here. Factory connectors here to the computer, all the sensors for O2 and whatnot, so it's a big ball of wiring there. And the reason why I eliminated the factory wiring was because I went out and I bought a Megasquirt computer, which I'll show you. And there's the computer installed. It's very small. You can kind of see it's smaller than the palm of your hand. And here's all the wiring. There's a lot of wiring actually I'm not using, but that's all laid out here. This is the wiring that I'm not using, so I decided not to run it through the firewall here. But I figured I'd just make a video here on actually installing a Microsquirt and what it takes to do. Kind of maybe do a full, maybe not a full step-by-step, but kind of do a rundown on installing a Microsquirt in your car. And it's really easy. I mean, it might sound difficult, but it's not. I looked up some wiring schematics of the original car here, and all you got to do is just find out where some power wires go, where some ground wires are located. And once you got that figured out, then you can wire it into the actual computer itself. So you can see here, I got some of the wiring done. I figured out where some of the routing goes for this, and I got the TPS sensor here. That's all wired in. I'm not going to run an idle air control valve. I don't think. At least I'm not wiring it up right now. I might wire it up later, but right now I don't have it wired up. I'm going to see if it'll idle without it here. And my goal here is not to really have a full wire tuck. That's going to be almost impossible. But I want to make the wiring as clean as possible. You know, if you just want to throw it together, you can throw it together really quickly, and you can probably have it running in 2 days if you really want it, if you don't really care how the wiring looks or how the wiring's routed. But I kind of want to have all the wiring hidden as much as possible. And that's what I've kind of done here. So the wiring is going to come out of here, run down here. It's all going to run back in this area here along the head, and then up to where it needs to go, and down to where it needs to go. But it'll all be kind of contained back in this area, so you won't really see it. You'll just see the loom coming out of the firewall here, and then it'll disappear under the intake manifold. Try to make it as clean as possible. So what I'll do in this vid is I'm going to show you where I got my power wire from to feed the computer, where the ground wires are run, where the wires that I use for the ignition system and the coils, the power wire that feeds the coils, the ground wire from the coils and where it goes, which wires do what here in the color coding. I'll go over all of that, and it's going to be a long video probably. It's going to take several days to film this, but that's no big deal. But I figure I'll walk you guys through the process of wiring this in your car, and maybe there'll be more of these swaps because of it. It's super simple. So let's get started. Alright guys, so the Microsquirt that I purchased came with an 8-foot harness, and you can see this is all the extra wire, like I said before, but there's going to be quite a bit left over, and that's fine. You can order a 30-inch harness if you want to keep the factory harness, and you can integrate that into the factory harness for your fuel injectors and all your different sensors. I chose to get the 8-foot harness, kind of start from scratch and eliminate the majority of the factory harness. And I also even though I did eliminate a lot of the factory harness, I did incorporate the new Microsquirt harness into the factory harness, and I'll show you how I did that here. So here is our C203 connector, and this is in the factory location. And a lot of the stuff in here I ended up not using, but A lot of the stuff, you know, it would go to the AC clutch relay. I'm not keeping the AC, so I'm not worried about keeping any of that stuff. This line here was a constant 12-volt power source. I'm not using that. A lot of this stuff is just not used in my application. If you want to incorporate a lot of the wires in here, I'm going to say this a bunch of times. Follow the wiring guide on the internet. It's pretty accurate. If you just type in, you know, C203 connector, you'll get your wiring pinouts. Follow the wiring pinouts. So the factory computer had a power wire coming off the C203 and actually ran to the computer, and that's what powered the computer. I used that same wire, and it goes to the red wire in the Microsquirt harness. And then there was the factory fuel injector wire harness that came from the fuse panel, and I'm using those two as well to feed power to the injectors. Now, you know, if you want to build your own harness to go to the injectors, you know, with relays and fuse panel, if you wanted to mount all that stuff up, you can. I decided to use what already came with the car and use the fuse block and the relays and all that stuff that comes with it to power my injectors and to power the computer and all that stuff instead of building a whole new relay. So other than the injectors, the only other factory wires I ended up using from the C203 were the speedometer wires, which are the yellow and the purple ones here. And I just tucked that into the loom here and fed it through the factory connector up here. And then all this extra wire I'm just going to loom up and tie up out of the way when everything else is done. And that's it for the C203 as far as it goes for me. Once again, it was the pink and black wire here for the computer power, and the two pink wires for my fuel injectors here, this pink and this pink white, and then the purple and the yellow, and that's it. And then the rest of the harness is the Microsquirt that feeds all the sensors. So now we'll come back topside here, and you can see the wires being fed through the harness, or through the firewall here. And all these wires are labeled, so I don't know if you're going to be able to read that or not, but that says IAT. That yellow one there says coolant. That one goes to the coolant sensor. This blue wire here, that says injector 2, so that's for injector bank 2. I got your sensor grounds here. These actually go to the computer to ground all the sensors. There's your ignition out 2. There's your injector out 1, that green wire there. And all you're going to do is, once again, follow the wiring schematic and wire the correct wire to where it needs to go on the sensor. So for instance, I'm running a, this is the injector harness, or I'm sorry, this is the harness for the map sensor. And it's got a green, an orange, and a gray. So there's a 5-volt reference, which is the gray. The orange wire is the, I want to say that might be the ground. And then the green wire is the feed to the computer. And here is the TPS. So our white and black stripe here, that's our sensor ground. The blue wire here is the TPS signal. And then the gray wire here is the 5-volt reference wire. Now you're going to have to be doing some cutting and splicing on this harness to get all the sensors in here. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can solder them if you want to, but I'm installing my harness in my car, so I want to have the lengths as close to perfect as possible to the correct length that I need for where the sensor's going. So I had to install all the sensors where they were going and then cut the harness to fit, but you don't have to do it that way. That's just the way that I did it. Now this harness here is for the ignition module, which is located right here, and I went ahead and I labeled this. I had to get a new pigtail. I just picked one up off of, I don't even remember where I got it, but you can probably find them on eBay or something, but this is the harness for it, and I went ahead and labeled it A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you can actually also find the a wiring schematic online for this harness too. So I believe A is coils 2 and 5, B is 1 and 4, and I believe C is 3 and 6. D is the ground to the computer. Is that right? Yep, D is the ground for the computer. E is the ground to the chassis, and then F here, this last one, that is your power to power your coils. And I got my power from the C500 block, and the C500 block is right here, right next to the factory battery location. And the power wire is actually the pink wire that comes out of the C500, and the factory pink wire actually feeds the factory coil with the distributor setup. And it's going to be this, I haven't wired it in yet, but it's going to be this pink wire here that goes to the coil. This is what actually supplies the voltage to the new coil set. That gives you your 12 volts from the battery right there. And I still have to wire that over there, but that's where that wire is going to go. For your injector wires, like I said before, in the C203, that comes through the firewall here, and this pink wire and then the pink white, the factory wires, these are going to be your power wires, and the computer actually grounds the injectors. And of course you can see there, well, it's not really legible, but it says injector 1 and injector 2 on the blue wire. And these are actually the ground wires from the computer, and these are what ground the injectors. So these are going to feed power to the injector, and then the black wires, you know, coming off the injector here, which you might have to splice in. This blue and this green, this is what's going to feed the grounds to each injector. So you'll just have to splice those in. So of course, one wire here is going to be your power on the injector, and then the other wire here is going to be your ground. And there you go. So I've already wired in this power wire and this ground wire, and then I just match the wire up to these power wires here, splice them in, and then the injectors are ready to go. Now the ground for the actual ECU, of course it runs through the firewall here. It wants you to ground it to the engine, and there's 2 ground wires, so I just brought them in here together, and I am going to ground the computer right to the back of the head where the factory ground is at on the factory setup, right there on the back of the head. So that's where my ground wires here are going to go. Stepping back in the vehicle here, there were a couple of wires here that I didn't go over, and that would be this green and yellow wire, and this is coming from the computer, and this is the tachometer out wire. So you're going to feed this to the tach wire, and the tach wire, it comes through, I changed mine already for an aftermarket tach, but it's on this side of the harness over here. It's a white wire, and you can splice it in there, but I'm running an aftermarket tach, so I'm just going to run this green-white wire, or this green-yellow wire, to the aftermarket tachometer, and that's going to give me my tach out. Okay, so this pink wire here, it's going to be hard to read, but this says O2 on it, and this is for the O2 wire, and I am running a wideband, so I'm going to run this to the wideband controller on the dash, and this is, and the sensor comes from the exhaust, goes into the wideband, and then there's a wideband out signal, which this wire will tap into, which will give me the O2 sensor readings to the Microsquirt. So that pretty much covers the wiring and what you need to do. If you have any questions on that, feel free to ask. So after this, I'm going to go ahead and fire up the laptop. Going to turn the computer on, and we'll go over some parameters to fire the sucker up. Okay, we got the software pulled up here, and this is what your main dashboard is going to look like. It says offline because I'm not actually connected to the computer. And I'm going to go over the basic settings here and the inputs that I used to get my car started. So first we'll go up to basic load settings, And we'll go to engine and sequential settings. And here's how I have mine set up. So I have it set to speed density because I'm using a map sensor. Alternating, 4-stroke, of course, number of cylinders 6, number of injectors 6. It's going to ask you for your engine size, you're going to put that in, and then you're going to put your injector size in. And I'm running 80-pound injectors, which is approximately 830 cc's. Sequential injection, I'm not using that, so mine's set to untimed. Standard drivers, where I have mine set to, okay? And then that's where you're going to set that up, so let's close that out. Okay, we'll go back up to basic load settings here. We'll go to general settings. And I have mine set for none for barometric correction. Map sensor input port, and that's going to be the map. I use the map wire, so we're going to set that to map. I didn't change any of these settings here. Single table. I changed my fuel table size to a 16 by 16, but you can set it up for 12 by 12. I wanted more tables there. So here we go. Coolant map tables are in Fahrenheit. You can set that to Celsius if you want. I'm going to set our primary fuel load to speed density. Secondary fuel load, I disable that. Okay. Come down here. There's the rest of my settings, and we'll close that out. So what we'll do is we'll come back up here. Now if you're going to use an aftermarket tack, or you're going to try to use the factory tack and wire in the factory tack, you can go to tack output, and you're going to want to make sure that you set that to on. Okay. Default is turned off, so you're going to want to set that to on. And of course you have an output pin for your tack, and it gives you different options here of what you can use to output to your tachometer. I use the tack out wire, so I set it to tack out, and then we can close that out. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll go up to our fuel settings here, and we will go to our injector dead time. And if you order aftermarket injectors, hopefully you'll get a sheet of paper that will tell you what your injector dead time is. Mine is around 0.845, so that's what I set in. I actually think it was around 0.82 or 0.81, but I set mine at 0.845. And there's the rest of the settings. We can close that out. Go back up to fuel. And you can go down to our wideband control. And this sets up your wideband control. So since I'm using a wideband, I have mine set to a single wideband. You can set it to a narrow band, whatever you want to set it to, or you can even disable it. So basically, the computer gets no input from the O2 sensor. And then here's the rest of my settings. I changed a couple of these from the default. We'll close that out. Then we'll go to our ignition settings. We will go to Ignition Options Wheel Decoder, and this is how your computer is going to realize what sort of trigger wheel that you have on your crank. If you have a 7x DIS wheel, a 58 times wheel, or a 60-2 wheel, 36-2 wheel, it all depends. But I set mine to tooth wheel because I'm using the factory toothed wheel on the crank. I set my input capture to rising edge, spark output going high, number of coils. The factory 3900 LZ9 uses a wasted spark, and my spark output is ignition 1, and that's what's actually wired to the coil is ignition 1 wire, okay? And then single wheel with missing teeth, right? Because that's what the factory crank wheel uses, and it's a 60 wheel. 60 teeth minus 2, because there's 2 missing teeth, so it's a 58 times wheel, so 60 minus 2 is 58. And I set my number 1 tooth angle at 80. Wheel speed, crank wheel. And this is how I set up the rest of this up here. I didn't change too much on here. I think I changed my dwell time. I'm not sure what the input was from the what the computer recommended here, but I changed it, not much, but barely. And so this is important to get correct. This is important to get correct so that your computer knows the type of crank wheel you're working with. So what we can do, we can go back up into our fuel table. We can go down to fuel VE table, and this is going to be your VE table that your computer is going to just generate automatically when you put in your load settings here for what sort of fuel you're using and what sort of what size injectors you have and the displacement of your engine. And when you set all this stuff up, it's going to create a fuel VE table, and mine was not even close. I had to increase my fuel VE table by about 75% off of the original here that the computer recommended. It was just too lean. Maybe on the factory camshaft and factory fuel injection, maybe the parameters were correct, but you can see here I'm up around 60 in this area, and this is kind of where I idle right here, and I'm up around 60 or so, and the original settings were around 32, so I've almost doubled that. So 75, 80%, 90%. And then all these in here I also had to adjust as well. Okay, we can go up to our ignition settings here. We can go down to our ignition table. And I haven't touched any of this yet, but this is the ignition table here. This just has your timing in here. You can see here at 120 kilopascals, which is 3 pounds of boost or so. At 4100 RPM, I'm running 26 degrees of timing. I don't think that's too radical. But I haven't really touched any of this stuff at all. So I'll play with all that later. And what we can do, we can go back up here to our fuel settings. We can actually go down to our AFR table. And if you have your wideband hooked up, you can actually tell the computer where you want your AFR to be in these areas. Okay. And I haven't really played with these too much. I made some adjustments in the higher boost settings here. I wanted it a little bit richer. I can always lean it out, but I'd rather have it a little bit richer than leaner. And that, guys, is the general settings that I used to get my car started. Alright guys, and here's the final result of the wiring. You can see here I got my IAT sensor into my intake pipe. One thing I didn't go over earlier on is the crank sensor. Now it's down underneath the block here. I kind of forgot to cover it, but the crank of course needs to be wired in, and just follow the wiring schematic for the crank. You have to insert a resistor in there, but just go ahead and follow the wiring diagram per the specs from Microsquirt, and you can't go wrong. But this is kind of how my wiring turned out. You can see that it's pretty hidden. My TPS sensor is here, ignition here. It all runs up underneath the intake neck, and then it comes out on this loom here and runs up into the firewall. It's all pretty hidden. It's not a full wire tuck, obviously, but it's a half wire tuck. It's all cleaned up. Pretty much all the wiring is on this side, and it's underneath the intake manifold, so it's hidden. The only wires that I have using out of here now are for the alternator and the red ignition wire that goes to the coil pack here on here. So those are the only wires running out of the C500 now. And then of course the starter wire. So this wire bundle in here is to the alternator and such, and then this one here goes to the starter. So that's all I'm using out of there now. Really cleaned it all up. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it helped you guys out. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments section, and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks guys. Stay tuned for the next one.